On a cold, rainy night, a little girl knocked on a billionaire's mansion door, shivering and asking for help. He had no idea that behind her innocent eyes hid a truth that would shatter his world. She wasn't just a stranger in need. She was the key to the family he never knew he had. Before we dive into today's emotional story, I'd love to know, where are you watching me from, and what time is it there right now? The storm outside was merciless, the kind of night where the sky seemed to wage war against the earth, its rage echoing through endless claps of thunder that rattled the very bones of the city, while sheets of rain hammered down like arrows on rooftops and windows. Inside one of the largest mansions on the outskirts of town sat Alexander Reed, a man the world admired and feared in equal measure, the ruthless millionaire CEO whose name was synonymous with power, whose signature alone could make or break fortunes, a man who had built walls of stone around his empire and walls of ice around his heart, so that nothing, neither love nor compassion, could ever breach them again. And there he sat, in his lavish leather chair, staring blankly at the fire that crackled in the vast stone hearth, the flames dancing mockingly, offering warmth he didn't feel, reflecting back into the eyes of a man who had everything and nothing all at once. The mansion was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old beams or the relentless hammer of rain on the tall glass windows, and Alexander, though surrounded by every luxury money could buy, felt the bitter emptiness of solitude echo louder than the thunder outside, for his empire was vast, yet his soul was barren, and while people envied his life, not one of them envied his loneliness. Then, slicing through the storm, a sound unlike any other filled the night, a sound so out of place that Alexander, who was used to silence and control, stiffened immediately. Knock, knock, knock. He frowned, his jaw tightening in irritation, for who in their right mind would come to his home in such weather, much less dare to disturb him uninvited? At first he ignored it, assuming it must have been the storm, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. So faint yet so desperate that it carried an ache with it, a plea embedded in its rhythm, as though the sound, it itself, were asking for mercy. Alexander rose slowly, each footstep echoing across the marble floor of his grand hallway, the lights casting long shadows that seemed to follow him like ghosts of his past as he made his way toward the towering oak door, his expression carved in stone, but his heart beating strangely faster, a sensation he had not known in years. With one swift motion, he unlatched the door and pulled it open, and for the first time in a long while, Alexander Reed, man of steel, unbending, unshaken, froze completely. For there, standing in the downpour, was a little girl, no more than 6 years old, her golden hair plastered against her cheeks, strands dripping rain like rivers down her tiny face, her small hands wrapped tightly around her body as though to shield herself from the cold, her sharp pink frock clinging to her fragile frame, the fabric soaked through until it offered no warmth, only exposure. She trembled violently, her lips pale, her eyes wide and shimmering with tears that the rain couldn't hide, and she looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hope so raw that it pierced straight through the armor of his heart. For a long moment neither spoke, the storm raging behind her and the silence of his mansion looming behind him, until finally her small, trembling voice rose above the roar of the rain, breaking like fragile glass against the night. "Please, sir, may I sleep in your garage tonight?" And those words, so simple yet so heartbreaking, struck Alexander harder than any thunderbolt could, for this little child had not asked for food, or warmth, or love, only for a corner of his garage, a place fit for cars, not children, and yet for her it would have been enough. Alexander's breath caught, his hand tightening on the heavy doorframe as conflicting emotions tore through him, the instinct to shut her out clashing violently with the unfamiliar sting of compassion that had long been buried beneath layers of pride and ruthlessness. His eyes scanned her trembling frame, her innocence drowning in the cruelty of a world that should have protected her, and he felt a strange ache, an ache he had long forgotten, press hard against his chest, as if his own heart were reminding him that once, long ago, he had known what it was like to care, to love, to lose. Yet even as the storm raged louder, it was nothing compared to the storm rising inside Alexander Reed, because in that moment he knew, with terrifying clarity, that this was not just a knock on his door, it was a knock on his soul, a test of the man he had become, and though the world knew him as ruthless, as cold, as untouchable, standing before this fragile little girl, shivering in the rain and begging for nothing more than a space in his garage, he realized he could no longer hide behind the walls he had built, and so he stood there, torn, staring at her with eyes that betrayed the war within, not yet ready to answer, not yet ready to admit what was happening to him, but knowing without doubt that whatever choice he made in this moment would change his life forever. Alexander's chest rose and fell as he looked down at the drenched little girl, his ruthless mind whispering to send her away, but his melting heart screaming to let her in, and for the first time in years, he didn't know which voice he would obey. For a long, unbearable moment, Alexander stood frozen at the doorway, his hand still gripping the frame as if it were the only thing tethering him to reason, while the storm continued its wild symphony outside. His eyes locked on the trembling girl before him, and though every instinct he had built as a ruthless man urged him to close the door and return to his world of controlled solitude, something deeper, a flicker of humanity he thought long extinguished, pressed against his chest, demanding he do otherwise. Slowly, almost against his will, he bent down on one knee so his cold blue eyes could meet the little girl's tear-drowned ones, his voice softening in a way he hardly recognized as his own as he asked, "Why are you out here alone? Where are your parents?" And for a moment she only blinked at him, her lashes heavy with raindrops, her lips trembling as if she were afraid to speak, until finally, with a small hiccup that cracked the silence, she wiped her soaked cheeks with the back of her tiny hand and whispered the kind of truth that could split a grown man in two. "My real daddy, he died when I was just 2. And tonight my stepdaddy kicked me out. He said," her voice faltered, breaking into sobs that shook her fragile body. "He said I'm not his soul." The words, fragile yet brutal, sliced through the grandeur of Alexander's mansion, like lightning tearing through the sky, echoing against the marble halls until it seemed the very walls grieved with her. Alexander felt the air in his lungs tighten, the indifference he had mastered for years crumbling as he listened to a child explain abandonment with a rawness no child should ever know, and he felt, for the first time in years, a stir within his chest, a forgotten ache pressing hard against his ribs, an unfamiliar warmth threatening to break through the ice he had wrapped around his heart. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself, but the girl's sobs grew louder, bouncing off the empty corridors that had known nothing but silence for so long, filling them with a pain so human, so real, that Alexander's throat burned. He reached out, hesitant at first, his hand hovering above her damp hair before lowering it gently, brushing his palm against the golden strands as he whispered, voice breaking with an emotion he did not dare name, "No, little one. You don't belong in a garage. My home is yours." As soon as the words left his lips, he felt something strange. The weight of his empire lifted slightly, as if those simple, heartfelt words had freed him more than they had comforted her. The girl's sobs quieted for a moment, her wide eyes blinking up at him as though she could not believe what she had just heard, and before he could stop himself, Alexander slipped his strong arms beneath her frail frame and lifted her gently from the storm, cradling her against his chest. Her wet frock clung to his tailored suit, soaking the expensive fabric, but for once Alexander did not care about appearances, wealth, or control. He only cared that this tiny soul was no longer shivering on his doorstep. He turned back into the mansion, carrying her inside, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to seal not just the storm outside, but the life he had lived until this very moment. He walked through the dim hall, his arms steady but his heart unsteady, and he could feel her small body press against him, could hear her soft hiccups against his shoulder, could feel the fragility of a child who had been broken too many times already, and as he paused in the grand hall, the girl's tiny voice rose again, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, but the words were clear enough to shake him to his core. "Will you really let me stay, sir, even though nobody else wants me?" Alexander froze mid-step, her question digging deep into wounds he had buried long ago, and before he could even answer, the little girl whispered something else into his ear, something so unexpected it left him trembling. Alexander stood in the grand hall of his mansion, the weight of the little girl cradled against his chest heavier than any burden his empire had ever placed upon him. Yet it wasn't her body that weighed on him, but the words she had whispered moments earlier, words that carried the ache of abandonment and the fragile hope of belonging. And as he carried her deeper into the house, the storm outside dimming into background thunder, her small voice rose again, delicate yet piercing, cutting through the silence like a plea he could not ignore. "Do you know where my mommy is? Stepdaddy threw her out while I was at school today. Now, I don't know where she is." The innocence in her tone mixed with the devastation of her confession sent a chill racing down Alexander's spine, his stride faltering for the first time as if the question had turned his legs to stone, and he froze mid-step, staring into the emptiness of the hallway as though her words had cracked open a door to his past he had spent years bolting shut. He had long ago buried the pain of his own broken family, of the divorce that had gutted him so thoroughly he had sworn never to feel again, and yet here was this small child, trembling in his arms, unknowingly tugging at the same wounds he thought time had sealed, reopening scars with her soft, desperate voice. He tightened his hold around her, not to reassure her, though she clearly needed it, but to steady himself, for inside his mind questions swirled like a raging tide. Who was this girl truly? Why did her eyes seem to carry an echo of something hauntingly familiar? Why did her presence feel less like chance and more like destiny? He lowered his gaze to her fragile face, her wide eyes shimmering with a plea that begged for more than comfort. It begged for truth, for safety, for a promise. And in a voice softer than he knew he could muster, he replied, "I'll help you find her." The words left his lips like a vow, quiet but resolute, binding him in a way no business contract or empire ever could, and as he carried her upstairs, the creak of the steps under his measured pace seemed almost symbolic, as though the house itself recognized that something extraordinary had just been set in motion. He reached the guest chamber, a room grander than many homes, but as he laid her gently on the plush bed, he saw how small she looked against the vastness of the space, a fragile soul drowning in luxury that was not hers. And as he tucked the thick blanket around her shoulders, she looked up at him with those eyes, those impossibly familiar eyes, that seemed to hold both innocence and unspoken history. He lingered there, brushing a wet strand of hair from her forehead, his heart pounding with a confusion he could not name, and as her breathing softened into the rhythm of sleep, he bent closer, whispering words meant only for himself. Words that escaped like a confession pulled from the depths of a man who no longer recognized his own reflection. "Why do her eyes look like someone I once loved?" His voice cracked at the end, for he knew that if the truth he feared were real, the storm outside would be nothing compared to the storm about to unravel inside his heart. Alexander straightened slowly, staring down at the girl's sleeping form, and though her innocence cloaked her like a shield, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that fate had just delivered to his doorstep, not only a child in need, but the ghost of a love he thought he had lost forever. The sun rose timidly after the violent storm, its pale light slipping through the tall glass windows of Alexander Reed's mansion, illuminating corners that had long been abandoned to silence. And for the first time in years, the house seemed less like a fortress of wealth and more like a home, as little Lily, now freshly dressed in one of the soft robes the maids had hurriedly found for her, sat at the long mahogany dining table with her feet dangling off the chair, her golden hair catching the morning glow as she took tentative bites of warm pancakes, glancing every now and then at the man who sat across from her, the man the world called a ruthless millionaire but who, at this very moment, was watching her with a gentleness he did not know he still possessed. Her small voice, trembling but filled with desperate hope, broke the quiet as she asked if he truly meant to help her find her mother. Her wide eyes locked on his face as if his answer determined the fate of her entire world, and Alexander, his chest tightening with a strange unfamiliar warmth, leaned forward with a firmness that surprised even himself and missed that he would search every corner of the city, every hidden alley, every crowded street until her mother was found, his words carrying the weight of an oath that seemed to echo through the massive hall like the vow of a knight long lost to battle but returning to honor. And so, with determination blazing in his heart, he began his quest, stepping out of his mansion and into a city that had once only known him as a merciless businessman, but was now to witness him as a man on a personal mission, his luxury car slicing through the morning traffic as he drove from hospitals to police stations, from bus terminals to airports, speaking to officials and strangers alike, his deep voice steady but urgent as he described the missing woman, a young mother with warm brown eyes, ebony hair, and a face both tender and strong, and though many shook their heads in regret, some nodding with sympathy, he pressed on, refusing to let weariness slow him, his determination only growing each time Lily's innocent face flashed before him, reminding him that this was no longer about business deals or profits, but about the fragile heartbeat of a child who believed in him. He placed calls to his private investigators, summoning the finest in the city and offering sums of money that made them widen their eyes, ordering them to scour records, surveillance, witness reports, and anything that might hold a trace of the woman he sought. His reputation as a man who got what he wanted now turned into a weapon for compassion rather than conquest, and as hours passed, his journey took him deeper into places he had never set foot in before. Crowded shelters, dimly lit clinics, and lonely bus stops where weary souls carried their lives in bags and fading memories, and in every place he carried Lily's story like a torch, a man who had once been indifferent to suffering now carrying another's pain as though it were his own. The city itself seemed to whisper secrets as he moved, its rain-soaked streets and restless crowds blurring past him, and just when exhaustion began to creep into his bones, he stepped into yet another hospital, his tall figure drawing eyes as he approached the reception, his voice low but commanding as he gave the same description once more. And for a moment, the nurse behind the counter froze, her eyes narrowing with the flicker of recognition before she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper heavy with disbelief, saying that she thought she had seen a woman matching that description recently, but her words trembled as she added that he would not believe who she was, leaving Alexander's chest tight with anticipation and dread, his pulse racing as he realized the search was about to reveal more than he had ever imagined. The nurse's whisper hung in the air, and Alexander's breath caught. Was the missing mother a stranger, or someone who had once been the very center of his own broken past? The sun rose timidly after the violent storm, its pale light slipping through the tall glass windows of Alexander Reed's mansion, illuminating corners that had long been abandoned to silence, and for the first time in years, the house seemed less like a fortress of wealth, and more like a home, as little Lily, now freshly dressed in one of the soft robes the maids had hurriedly found for her, sat at the long mahogany dining table with her feet dangling off the chair, her golden hair catching the morning glow as she took tentative bites of warm pancakes, glancing every now and then at the man who sat across from her, the man the world called a ruthless millionaire, but who, at this very moment, was watching her with a gentleness he did not know he still possessed. Her small voice, trembling but filled with desperate hope, broke the quiet as she asked if he truly meant to help her find her mother. Her wide eyes locked on his face, as if his answer determined the fate of her entire world, and Alexander, his chest tightening with a strange unfamiliar warmth, leaned forward with a firmness that surprised even himself, and promised that he would search every corner of the city, every hidden alley, every crowded street until her mother was found, his words carrying the weight of an oath that seemed to echo through the massive hall like the vow of a knight long lost to battle but returning to honor. And so, with determination blazing in his heart, he began his quest, stepping out of his mansion and into a city that had once only known him as a merciless businessman, but was now to witness him as a man on a personal mission, his luxury car slicing through the morning traffic as he drove from hospitals to police stations, from bus terminals to airports, speaking to officials and strangers alike, his deep voice steady but urgent as he described the missing woman, a young mother with warm brown eyes, ebony hair, and a face both tender and strong, and though many shook their heads in regret, some nodding with sympathy, he pressed on, refusing to let weariness slow him, his determination only growing each time Lily's innocent face flashed before him, reminding him that this was no longer about business deals or profits, but about the fragile heartbeat of a child who believed in him. He placed calls to his private investigators, summoning the finest in the city and offering sums of money that made them widen their eyes, ordering them to scour records, surveillance, witness reports, and anything that might hold a trace of the woman he sought. His reputation as a man who got what he wanted now turned into a weapon for compassion rather than conquest, and as hours passed, his journey took him deeper into places he had never set foot in before. Crowded shelters, dimly lit clinics, and lonely bus stops where weary souls carried their lives in bags and fading memories, and in every place he carried Lily's story like a torch, a man who had once been indifferent to suffering now carrying another's pain as though it were his own. The city itself seemed to whisper secrets as he moved, its rain-soaked streets and restless crowds blurring past him, and just when exhaustion began to creep into his bones, he stepped into yet another hospital, his tall figure drawing eyes as he approached the reception, his voice low but commanding as he gave the same description once more, and for a moment the nurse behind the counter froze, her eyes narrowing with the flicker of recognition before she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper heavy with disbelief, saying that she thought she had seen a woman matching that description recently, but her words trembled as she added that he would not believe who she was, leaving Alexander's chest tight with anticipation and dread, his pulse racing as he realized the search was about to reveal more than he had ever imagined. The nurse's whisper hung in the air, and Alexander's breath caught. Was the missing mother a stranger, or someone who had once been the very center of his own broken past? The nurse's trembling hands slid a worn hospital file across the counter, her voice faltering as she urged him to read it, and when Alexander's sharp blue eyes scanned the faded papers, the name scrawled at the top struck him like lightning tearing through the storm. Isabella Carter. And for a heartbeat his world stopped turning, the walls of the hospital fading into a blur as memories long buried surged back with brutal force. Isabella, the woman he had once sworn to love until his last breath, the woman who had filled his empty life with laughter and warmth, the woman he had abandoned in a moment of ruthless pride when his hunger for empire outweighed the fragile beauty of their marriage. The woman whose tears had once begged him to choose love over ego, but whose pleas had gone unanswered, leaving only silence and shattered vows in their wake. His throat tightened as the realization clawed at him. If Isabella had been here, if she had been admitted under desperation and so, then vanished again, that meant she was out there, alone, wounded, carrying scars not only of her present but of the past he had forced upon her, and as he clutched the file tighter, his chest burned with a question that nearly buckled his knees. Could Lily, the golden-haired girl who had knocked on his door, whose innocent eyes mirrored a gaze he had once adored, be his own flesh and blood? The thought sent tremors racing through him, and his heart, once cold as iron, cracked wide open under the unbearable weight of possibility, guilt, and yearning, and as the nurse's words repeated in his ears, "She was here, but she left before treatment could be completed, as if she was running from someone or something." He knew with terrifying clarity that Isabella was slipping further into shadows, perhaps believing she had no one left to turn to, unaware that fate had dragged him back into her orbit through the fragile hands of a child who deserved far better than the cruelties she had endured. Alexander's pulse thundered as he slammed the file shut and stormed toward the hospital exit, his footsteps echoing like war drums down the sterile corridor, staff turning to watch as the man once known only for ruthless business deals now looked like a soul set aflame, desperate not for contracts or power, but for redemption, for a chance to right the greatest wrong of his life. Outside, the city buzzed under the pale morning light, cars weaving through slick streets, but to him, it was all a blur. Every honk, every shadow, every drop of rain clinging to the air, reminding him of the night a small girl had knocked on his door and unknowingly handed him the key back to a life he had forsaken. And as he gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black car, determination surged through his veins. He would not let Isabella vanish again, not into the nameless crowd, not into despair, not when the Talcui Ruth hovered so close to the surface, not when a child's trembling plea had already rewritten the path of his hardened heart. His jaw clenched, his voice a low growl as he whispered into the empty car. "Hold on, Isabella, I'm coming for you." Before pressing his foot on the accelerator, the roar of the engine matching the storm within him, and as the city raced past his window, he knew only one thing for certain, that this search was no longer about duty or kindness, but about salvation, his own and theirs, and that every second he lost could be the difference between reunion and regret that would haunt him until his dying breath. Alexander's car sped into the unknown, but in the back of his mind one truth screamed louder than the city's chaos. If Isabella was truly Lily's mother, then the little girl he had taken in was not a stranger at all. She was his daughter. The chaos of the city blurred as Alexander's car screeched to a halt outside the central bus station, his eyes scanning desperately over the sea of faces, travelers dragging bags, families huddling together, lost souls waiting for departures that might never bring them home, and in that endless crowd his heart lurched violently when he saw her, Isabella, standing near the far end of the platform beneath a flickering light, her posture weary yet dignified, her once radiant face pale with exhaustion, her clothes damp from the night's storm, her hair tangled yet still framing her features with a fragile beauty that time had not erased, and though she looked broken by life's cruel hand, she held herself with a quiet grace that made her stand out like a lone flower blooming through cracks of concrete. Alexander's breath caught, the years collapsing in a single heartbeat, memories rushing forward like a flood he could no longer dam, her laughter echoing in his mind, the warmth of her touch, the way she used to look at him before pride had built a wall between them, and his voice, unsteady and softer than it had been in years, escaped his lips in a whisper carried by desperation. "Isabella." She stiffened instantly at the sound, her body turning with hesitant slowness, and when her eyes met his, the world seemed to stop. Those brown eyes he had once drowned in widened in shock, disbelief flashing across her face as her trembling lips formed his name. "Alexander, why are you here?" Her tone carrying a mixture of fear, anger, and a longing she quickly tried to mask, and for a moment he could not answer, the weight of their past choking the words in his throat. But before silence could grow unbearable, the tiny voice of hope broke through as little Lily, who had been clutching his coat nervously until then, suddenly wriggled free and dashed forward with unrestrained joy, her small feet splashing through shallow puddles as she cried out with pure relief, "Mommy! Mommy! I found a man who helped me!" And in an instant Isabella dropped to her knees, her arms opening wide to catch her daughter, pressing the child tightly against her chest as though she feared letting go would make her vanish again, tears streaming freely down her cheeks as she buried her face in Lily's golden hair, whispering broken thank yous against her small shoulders, while Alexander stood frozen only a few steps away, his chest aching at the sight, his soul tearing open at the reunion he had both dreaded and longed for, knowing that this was the moment where every buried truth was clawing its way to the surface. And then Isabella's gaze lifted, her eyes locking on his with a storm of emotions, grief for the years lost, fury for the wounds he had left, confusion at his presence, but above all, a question that trembled on her lips until it spilled out in a whisper heavy with pain and disbelief. "Why, after all these years, are you the one standing beside her?" Her voice slicing through him like a blade, because it carried the weight of every abandoned night, every tear she had shed alone, every sacrifice she had made without him, and though his lips parted, words of explanation tangled in his throat, he knew there was no excuse strong enough to mend what he had broken, but before he could even attempt to speak, Isabella's body trembled, her arms tightening protectively around Lily as if shielding her from a storm about to rise, and in that fragile moment she let slip words that made Alexander's entire world tilt, a confession delivered in a trembling voice that revealed a truth far heavier than the weight of their past, a truth that left his heart pounding with a fear he had never known, for he realized he was about to hear something he was not prepared to face. Isabella's lips quivered as she whispered the truth, words that would unravel Alexander's world and force him to confront the possibility that Lily was not only her child, but his own flesh and blood. The bus station seemed to vanish into silence, the crowd blurring into faceless shadows as Isabella's trembling confession pierced the air, her tear-soaked voice carrying the weight of years stolen by pride and silence. "Alexander, Lily is your daughter. I never told you because you were too busy with your empire, and when I tried to come back, it was too late. And in that single moment Alexander's chest tightened as though an iron fist had crushed the very breath out of him, his heart convulsing with a mixture of disbelief and anguish, his legs weakening until the ground beneath him seemed unsteady. For all this time, the innocent golden-haired child who had knocked on his door begging for a space in his garage, the same little girl whose voice had cracked as she pleaded for mercy, was not a stranger at all, but his own flesh and blood. A piece of his soul wandering in the storm while he had sat surrounded by wealth that suddenly felt like ash. His blue eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, clouded as memories of his arrogance flooded back. Every business deal he had prioritized over Isabella's tears. Every cold word he had spoken. Every wall he had built until she had no choice but to walk away carrying not just her own brokenness but his unborn child hidden from him. And the reality crashed over him that his empire, his millions, his skyscrapers meant nothing compared to the tiny heartbeat that had once fluttered beneath Isabella's ribs, the heartbeat he had never protected. He staggered back a step, clutching his chest as though bracing against the avalanche of guilt, and then, as if drawn by something greater than his pride, he dropped to his knees before Isabella and Lily, the ruthless CEO stripped away until only a man remained, raw, trembling, undone, his voice breaking as he whispered with a sincerity he had never known, "I failed you both once, but never again. Let me be the father she deserves. Let me be the man you once loved." The words pouring out of him like a prayer, each syllable carved from the depths of regret and the desperate hope for redemption. Lily blinked up at him, confusion and wonder mingling in her wide eyes as she clutched her mother's hand tighter, while Isabella's gaze bore into him, filled with storms of memory, of betrayal, of lonely nights, of dreams that had died because of him, but also carrying a flicker of something she could not extinguish, a fragile flame of the love they once shared, and the air between them thickened with the tension of 1,000 unsaid words, every heartbeat dragging them closer to a choice that could either heal the wounds of the past or rip them open beyond repair. Alexander's trembling hands reached out, not to claim but to plead, his head bowed in humility as his tears fell onto the cold concrete floor, the sound of his brokenness echoing louder in Isabella's heart than any promise he had ever made in wealthier days, and for the first time she saw him not as the arrogant man who had cast her aside, but as a father aching for the chance to be whole, a man who finally understood what truly mattered. Yet her chest ached with hesitation. For forgiveness was not so easily won, not when scars ran deep and trust had once been shattered, and as she looked down at Lily, who gazed between them with innocent hope, Isabella's own soul was torn apart, caught between the pain of the past that warned her not to fall again, and the whisper of a new beginning that beckoned her heart to believe once more. Isabella's tear-filled eyes locked on Alexander's, her lips parting as though to answer, but her silence stretched unbearably. Was she about to walk away forever? Or take the first fragile step toward rebuilding the family destiny had returned to her doorstep? Days melted into a gentle rhythm after the storm at the bus station, and in that fragile stretch of time, Alexander Reed, the man once feared as an untouchable CEO who built empires out of stone and steel, began to transform before the very eyes of those who had once thought him incapable of love, the sharpness of his voice softening, the hardness of his gaze warming, his every action no longer driven by profit or pride but by a desperate, sincere need to reclaim what he had lost. The mansion that had for years stood as a cold monument to his isolation now stirred with a life it had never known before, laughter echoing through vast halls that had once held only silence, tiny footsteps racing across marble floors that had never felt the warmth of a child's joy, and Alexander found himself drawn each morning to the sight of little Lily at the breakfast table, her golden hair gleaming in the sun, her smile a beacon that melted every remnant of the ice that had once entombed his heart, and when he bent down to press a kiss against her forehead, whispering in a voice raw with emotion, "My little angel, you'll never sleep in a garage again, my home is yours forever." He meant it not as a promise, but as a vow written into the very marrow of his soul, a vow to protect, to cherish, to stand as the father he had unknowingly been all along. Yet even as he reveled in this newfound light, his gaze often drifted to Isabella, the woman who had once been his wife, his first and only love, the woman whose tears had once been caused by his arrogance, but who now stood in his home again, her presence both a reminder of his failures and the fragile hope of redemption. And one evening, unable to carry the weight of silence any longer, Alexander reached for her trembling hands, his powerful frame seeming smaller as he looked into her eyes with humility rather than dominance, confessing with words that trembled on his lips. "I abandoned love once, but life gave me a second chance. Will you let me spend it making things right?" And for a heartbeat, Isabella's eyes shimmered with the pain of years gone by, memories of betrayal threatening to harden her heart. But then she looked at Lily, at the child who had unknowingly reunited them, and her tears, once born of sorrow, softened into something gentler, her lips curving into a faint smile as she whispered words that lifted the weight of despair from his chest. "Yes, Alexander, for her, and for us," granting him not only forgiveness but the gift of rebuilding, a chance most men never receive. And so the days that followed were painted in colors of renewal. Alexander learning the language of fatherhood with each bedtime story, each playful laugh, each protective embrace, Isabella finding strength not in forgetting the past, but in choosing to let the present heal it. And the mansion that had echoed with emptiness now pulsed with the warmth of family, its walls no longer adorned only with paintings of success, but with the living portrait of love, laughter, and new beginnings. And as the sun dipped low one golden evening, casting a soft glow across the grand living room where the three of them sat together, Lily clapped her small hands with a joy that filled every corner of the house and declared with childlike certainty, "Now we're a real family again," her innocent words striking deeper than any speech, for in that simple truth lay everything Alexander had ever searched for in power, but never found until now. And as he pulled Isabella and Lily into his arms, his lips pressing against their hair, his eyes glistening with tears he no longer tried to hide, the screen of their story faded, not on wealth or skyscrapers, not on deals or pride, but on the quiet, eternal embrace of a man, a woman, and their child, a family reborn, proving at last that true wealth was never measured in power or money, but in the love that stands beside you when everything else falls away.